10,000 years ago. People who once followed herds began planting grain and stacking mud bricks. From that quiet revolution grew pyramids taller than cathedrals, scripts that fixed memory in clay, and empires that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. City lights soon lined the Nile, Indus, Yellow River, and Andes, each hub sharing tools, stories, and dreams. Priests set calendars, traders linked seas with silk and pepper, and armies redrew borders again and again. Their achievements and their collapses still shape the world we wake up in today. Stay with us for the sweeping story of every ancient civilization, their genius, their wars, and the lessons they left behind. This is the story of every ancient civilization. When the last ice age ended around 9,700 BCE, the climate of Southwest Asia warmed and stabilized. Stands of einkorn, emmer, and barley ripened each spring in the valleys of the Levant and Upper Mesopotamia. Foragers in these regions had long gathered the wild grain, but new conditions made cultivation practical. At Abu Huraira on the Euphrates, layers dated to roughly 9,000 BCE preserved sickle blades, polished by repeated cutting, pits lined with baskets for storing seed, and the hoofprints of penned goats. Nearby at Jericho, families stacked sun-dried mud bricks into circular houses, sunk them below ground level for insulation, and protected the settlement with a massive stone wall and a 9-meter watchtower, the earliest known defensive architecture. The presence of carefully buried skulls, their faces modelled in plaster, hints that these early farmers already linked their identity to a single place and to the ancestors who shared it. 2 centuries later, the same hills produced a very different monument. On a limestone ridge now called Göbekli Tepe, hunter-gatherer groups quarried pillars of crystalline stone up to 6 meters tall. They arranged the pillars into circular enclosures and carved them with reliefs of leopards, snakes, boars, and cranes. Radiocarbon dates place the first construction close to 9,600 BCE. Before pottery, metal, or domesticated grain reached the region, excavations show little sign of ordinary habitation. No hearths, no refuse of everyday life. Instead, animal bones and huge storage vessels indicate large feasts. The builders, still living in scattered camps, seem to have gathered here for ceremony, quarrying and hauling blocks that weighed up to 20 tons. The scale of labour implies complex cooperation. The carvings reveal a symbolic world vivid enough to mobilise dispersed bands. Some archaeologists argue that periodic ritual gatherings spurred the social bonds and perhaps the need for stable food that later encouraged farming itself. By 7,400 BCE, a different experiment rose on the Konya plain of central Anatolia. Çatalhöyük grew into a dense settlement that may have housed 8,000 people without streets or alleys. Families entered their homes by roof openings, moving across a honeycomb of flat rooftops, much as modern pedestrians cross a plaza. Inside, walls were replastered each year and decorated with red ochre handprints, hunting scenes, and geometric patterns. Bulls' horns framed household shrines. Beneath packed earthen floors lay the flexed bodies of ancestors, placed there in quiet ceremonies that linked the living to their dead. Excavations reveal carbonized wheat, barley, and peas, the bones of domestic cattle and goats, and obsidian blades from Cappadocia, evidence of farming, herding, and long-distance trade. Yet no palace rises at Çatalhöyük, no temple district stands apart. Ritual objects appear in ordinary rooms, suggesting that belief and governance remained woven into household life, rather than delegated to rulers or priests. Across a span of scarcely 3 millennia, the Near East thus witnessed a chain of innovations that reshaped human existence. Grain fields replaced wild stands. Walls and towers guarded surplus harvests. Stone circles drew dispersed groups into shared rites, and sprawling villages demonstrated that thousands could live together without kings. The impulse to plant, to build, and to commemorate ancestors changed what it meant to be human, anchoring communities to place and time. From these quiet revolutions would grow the first true cities, writing systems and states, but their foundations lie in the dawn fires of Neolithic villages, the shadowed rings of Göbekli Tepe, and the crowded rooftops of Çatalhöyük, where settled life first found its 3500 BCE, the settlement of Uruk swelled beyond the size of any earlier community. Farmers draining the marshes sent barley and dates into storerooms. Shepherds drove sheep through canals to shearing pens. Boatmen poled cargoes of limestone and copper upriver. To keep track of all this movement, temple officials pressed pictographs into soft clay. A jar for oil, a head of grain for barley, a crude star for the sky goddess Inanna, who watched over the city. Those signs, simple at first, evolved into wedge-shaped strokes made with a cut reed. Cuneiform, the earliest writing humanity has yet found. Uruk's scribes were not writing poetry. Their first tablets are ledgers, yet the calculations changed everything. Surplus now had a memory. Priests could levy rations for labourers, schedule canal repairs, and tally wool before it left for distant workshops. With records came hierarchy. The temple district dominated the city, rising atop a stepped platform that foreshadowed the ziggurats of later centuries. Surrounding Uruk, dozens of smaller towns, Eridu, Larsa, Lagash, copied its innovations. Across the alluvial plain, the Sumerians laid the template for urban life. Irrigation ditches laced farm plots. Clay cones stamped with the ruler's name studded the walls of new shrines. Wheeled carts creaked between fields and quarries. Their achievements extended beyond administration. The Sumerians fitted copper blades to plows, charted the heavens into 12 constellations, and cast multi-part molds to make bronze axe heads. They sang the first literature we can still read, hymns to Inanna's fury and laments over shattered canals. And in the royal cemetery of they buried their elites with lapis beads, shell inlays, and a lyre whose golden bull's head still glitters in museums today. Power in Sumer never stayed long in one hand. Rival cities raided each other's canals, rerouted water, and toppled one another's statues. Into this quarrelsome landscape strode Sargon of Akkad around 2334 BCE. Legend says he was a foundling set adrift in a basket on the Euphrates. Fact records that he seized the city of Kish, marched south to humble Uruk, and then turned north and west until the cedar forests of Lebanon and the silver mines of Anatolia fell under his axe. Sargon's genius was administrative as much as military. From his still undiscovered capital Akkad, he appointed governors loyal to him alone, posted garrisons in rebellious towns, and standardized the Akkadian language, Semitic rather than Sumerian, for official business. His grandson Naram-Sin crowned the Age of Conquest, proclaiming himself king of the four quarters and wearing the horned headdress of a god. On a pink limestone stele, the divine king climbs a mountain of defeated foes while stars bless his ascent. A stone manifesto of universal rule. Yet empire proved fragile. Within a century, drought, internal revolt, and raids by the Gutians, highland tribes from the Zagros, brought Akkad low. Sargon's political experiment, however, could not be unlearned. The idea that many cities and languages might obey a single throne had entered Mesopotamia forever. Power drifted back south to Sumer around 2112 BCE, when Ur-Nammu founded the third dynasty of Ur. His reign marked a renaissance of Sumerian culture. Administrators filed tens of thousands of tablets detailing everything from temple menus to livestock tallies. Masons raised the great ziggurat of Ur, stacking millions of mud bricks into a pyramid whose battered core still stands against desert winds. Ur-Nammu added another innovation, the earliest surviving law code. Carved on clay in precise Sumerian, its clauses levy fines in silver for injuries and set fixed compensations for theft or negligence. Unlike later codes that demand eye for eye, Ur-Nammu's laws usually replace vengeance with payment, a glimpse of a society edging from clan honor towards state justice. His son Shulgi ruled nearly 50 years, standardizing weights, sponsoring long-distance roads lined with travelers' shelters, and, like Naram Sin before him, declaring himself divine. Yet Ur-3 too was mortal. Around 2004 BCE, Elamite armies from Iran breached the city walls, and Amorite tribes filtered into Mesopotamia, founding new dynasties in Babylon and Mari. Even so, the bureaucratic habits of Ur, regular taxation, fixed laws, royal archives, left deep roots. While Mesopotamian rulers battled for irrigation ditches, another civilization flourished 1,000 kilometers to the east. Between 2600 and 1900 BCE, the Indus Valley, stretching from the Himalayas to the Arabian Sea, hosted dozens of meticulously planned cities. At Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, brick houses stood on straight streets laid out in rectangles. Every home, even the humblest, boasted a bathing platform and a connection to covered drains that emptied outside the walls. No palace looms over these cities, no royal tomb or boastful steely names a conqueror. Instead, order appears in baked brick ratios identical across 1 million square kilometers, in standardized copper weights, and in stamped seals carved with unicorns, bulls, and short undeciphered scripts. The economy thrived on craft and commerce. Indus workshops mass-produced carnelian beads, faience bangles, and cotton textiles, the earliest known. Traders shipped these goods by river and sea. Archaeologists have found Indus seals in Mesopotamia and copper from Oman in Harappan warehouses. Granaries near the docks hint at civic control over grain, yet the lack of ostentatious graves suggests wealth was displayed more in shared infrastructure than in personal monuments. Religion leaves only clues. A bath complex, 12 meters long, may signal ritual purification. Figurines of horned deities could represent a proto-Shiva. Clay tablets show yogic postures that predate later Hindu iconography, but without reading their script, the Indus beliefs remain a whisper behind kiln-fired walls. Around 1900 BCE, the system faltered. Climate shifts altered river courses. The great Gagar-Hakra, perhaps the fabled Sarasvati, dried or moved. Long-distance trade waned. Bricks shrank in size. Writing disappeared. The cities emptied, and rural life took their place. Yet the Indus experiment proved that large populations could enjoy sanitation, standardization, and economic vigor without grandiose kings. Mesopotamian scribes, puzzled by exotic goods, wrote of a distant land called Meluha. Cylinder seals depict dark-skinned merchants leading stout bulls, and tablets list cargoes of ivory, carnelian, and timber arriving by sea at the port of Ur. Scholars now match Meluha with the Indus realm. From Harappan shipyards at Lothal and Sutkagan Dor, flat-bottom boats sailed down the Indus, caught the monsoon winds, and skirted the Arabian coast to Dilmun, Bahrain, and Sumer. Copper from Oman, lapis from Afghanistan, tin from far Central Asia, all passed through this maritime highway, linking river worlds separated by deserts. Trade was two-way. Mesopotamian silver, wool, and dates traveled east, so did ideas. Cylinder seal iconography migrates into Indus motifs, while Mesopotamian weight systems adapt to Indus cubes. When the Indus cities declined, Sumerian texts lament that the ships of Meluha no longer come. The pause rippled across economies. Craftsmen in Ur searched for new bead sources. Omani miners lost markets. Gulf entrepôts shrank. By the middle of the second millennium, BCE, the irrigated plains of Mesopotamia, and the distant gridded streets of the Indus had each reached peaks and faced upheavals. Yet together, they wrote the opening chapter of urban civilization. In Sumer, writing turned memory into clay. In Akkad, empire turned cities into provinces. At Ur, law turned judgment into precedent. Along the Indus, standard bricks and silent drains turned sanitation into a civic right. And seagoing merchants turned rivers into international corridors. The rivers themselves remained, brown and restless. They carried silt from distant mountains, renewed farmlands, and sometimes drowned them. They linked people separated by deserts and languages, tying together wheat fields near Uruk and cotton plots near Mohenjo-Daro in a single, if fragile, web of exchange. And long after palaces fell and scripts went dark, fishermen still cast nets in the Euphrates, and farmers still walked the dusty lanes of the old Harappan mounds, living among the layered ghosts of the first kingdoms whose stories began and ended with war. Djoser's architects began by stacking 6 stone mastabas, one atop another. The result, rising 60 meters above the Saqqara plain around 2650 BCE, was the world's first pyramid and the opening statement of Egypt's Old Kingdom. Behind that step monument stood the practical genius of Imhotep, who quarried limestone, invented durable mortar, and ringed the complex with a high wall pierced by a single gate. The polished facade caught the sun so fiercely that later Egyptians called stone buildings white. They were reflections of sunlight, anchors for eternity. For 2.5 centuries after Djoser, pharaohs refined both masonry and state power. Sneferu, founder of Dynasty 4, ordered at least 3 pyramids, experimenting with slopes until the graceful red pyramid at Dashur achieved the first true geometric pyramid. That success cleared the path for his son Khufu to attempt something unprecedented at Giza. Khufu's Great Pyramid originally stood 146 meters high and contained about 2.3 million blocks of limestone and granite. Its base deviated from perfect square alignment by less than 20 centimeters, a feat that required surveyors with sighting instruments, rope stretchers who could measure to fractions of a degree, and overseers who understood the seasonal pulse of labor. Contrary to older myths, the workforce was not a mass of whipped slaves. Excavations on the plateau's edge have revealed dormitories, bakeries, breweries, and physicians' tools. Teams of farmers rotated in during the Nile inundation, when their fields were underwater, working alongside skilled stonecutters and setting gangs named after pharaohs and deities. Friends of Khufu, the drunkards of Menkaure. Their daily bread and beer rations are etched on ostraca left behind. Cattle bones show prime cuts, not subsistence fare, confirming that pyramid building was a national project sustained by taxes in grain and livestock, rather than chains and lash. Religion drove the enterprise. Egyptians believed the cosmos functioned only when Ma'at, ordered harmony, was renewed. The king, considered a living Horus and posthumously an Osiris, mediated between gods and people. His burial thus needed permanence. Burial complexes bloomed around pyramids. Causeways linked valley temples on the Nile bank to mortuary temples at the pyramid's base, where priests performed daily offerings long after a king's death. Boat pits held full-size cedar vessels for the pharaoh's voyage with the sun god Ra across the heavens. Inside Khufu's pyramid, the narrow shafts from the king's chamber align with circumpolar stars, perhaps to provide the king's spirit a celestial conduit. This architectural bravado signaled administrative reach. At Memphis, viziers managed scribes who recorded crop yields down to fractions of a hecat. Gold arrived from Nubia, cedar from Byblos, turquoise from Sinai, copper from the eastern desert, The state's ideology was etched on limestone walls, but its arteries were irrigation ditches rerouting the Nile's bounty into royal granaries. Power began to fray in Dynasty 5. Pyramids shrank as resources spread thinner, and provincial governors, no marks, turned their nomes into mini-kingdoms. Dynastic rituals persisted. Unas decorated his burial chamber with pyramid texts, the oldest known Egyptian funerary scriptures, but the central treasury could no longer bankroll monuments on Khufu's scale. Diminishing Nile floods around 2200 BCE compounded the strain, and by 2150 BCE, the Old Kingdom dissolved into the First Intermediate Period, a century and a half of rival petty dynasties. Order returned under Mentuhotep II of Thebes, who reunified Egypt about 2030 BCE. He fused Lower and Upper Egypt's crowns and, to broadcast renewal, cut a terraced limestone mortuary temple into the cliffs of Deir el-Bahri, an architectural prelude to later wonders. Mentuhotep's successors re-established Memphis as an administrative hub, but many rulers now resided near the Fayum, exploiting new canal networks that drained marshland into farmland. Dynasty 12's engineers cut the Bar Youssef Canal to regulate Lake Moeris, converting seasonal swamps into a breadbasket. Literature flowered. Scribes copied tales that blended adventure with moral reflection. The story of Sinuhe, the dialogue of a man with his soul, introducing psychological nuance absent in earlier royal inscriptions. Coffin texts democratized spells once carved only on pyramid walls, allowing non-royal dead to navigate the afterlife. Sculptors shifted from serene idealism to contemplative realism, carving Senusret III with furrowed brow and sunken cheeks, as if monarchy now carried human burden. To the south, Middle Kingdom armies pushed into Nubia, building chained fortresses like Buhan and Semna that controlled gold mines and the cataract trade route. Yet the leadership remained pragmatic. When drought struck again around 1800 BCE, central authority faltered, but infrastructure endured, softening the blow. Ultimately, waves of Asiatic immigrants settled in the eastern delta, and by 1650 BCE, a Semitic elite, known later as the Hyksos, seized Avaris, ushering in the Second Intermediate Period. The Hyksos interlude ended with Ahmose I, a Theban prince who mastered horse-drawn chariot warfare, captured Avaris, and chased the Hyksos beyond Sinai around 1550 BCE. Ahmose's victory forged a militarized Egypt, determined never again to bow to foreigners. The 18th dynasty pharaohs pushed boundaries outward, turning Egypt into an empire. Thutmose III campaigned past the Euphrates. His grandson Thutmose III led at least 17 expeditions into Canaan and Syria, famously flanking enemy coalitions through the narrow Aruna Pass to win at Megiddo. Reliefs at Karnak list hundreds of towns that rendered tribute: ebony, lapis, horses, captive princes, creating a tributary system that funneled wealth south to Thebes. Hatshepsut, Thutmose III's stepmother, ruled first as regent, then as king in her own right. She prioritized trade over war, sending a fleet to Punt, likely modern Eritrea or Somalia, bringing back myrrh trees still depicted in vivid color on the terraces of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. A century later, Amenhotep III presided over an Egypt so opulent that foreign kings begged for Nubian gold. He built the vast palace city of Malkata and raised colossi 30 meters tall, yet left empires day to day to diplomats whose cuneiform letters, the Amarna tablets, reveal a web of alliances, bride exchanges, and gold shipments. His son Amenhotep IV, better known as Akhenaten, upended tradition, declaring Aten the sun disk, the sole god, and abandoning Thebes for a new capital, Akhetaten. Art at Amarna elongated limbs and showed the royal family in intimate domestic scenes, but Akhenaten's monotheistic zeal alienated priests and perhaps compromised Egypt's grip abroad. After his death, The 9-year reign of Tutankhamun saw a return to orthodoxy. His small tomb, hurriedly filled with gold masks, chariots, and alabaster lamps, offers a rare, intact snapshot of royal wealth. The 19th dynasty restored military vigor. Seti the White campaigned deep into Syria. His son Rameses II confronted Hittite forces at Kadesh on the Orontes around 1274 BCE. Although the battle ended as a stalemate, Rameses carved reliefs proclaiming personal triumph on every major temple, then sealed a peace treaty, the earliest surviving international accord, with Hittite king Hattusili III. Rameses married a Hittite princess, strengthened northern borders, and diverted resources to monument building on a pharaonic scale. The hypostyle hall at Karnak, the rock temples of Abu Simbel, and a new capital in the delta, P-Rameses. His reign of 66 years made Egypt the spectacle of the Near East. Yet, signs of strain accumulated. Grain ration records from Deir el-Medina revealed delayed payments. Tomb workers staged the first recorded labor strike in year 29 of Ramesses III, complaining of missed bread allotments. Foreign threats intensified. Libyan tribes pressed the western frontier, and a coalition the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples raided the delta. Ramesses III repelled them in a dramatic naval battle depicted at Medinet Habu, but victory brought no long-term respite. By 1070 BCE, the new kingdom fractured. High priests of Amun ruled Thebes, while princes in the delta styled themselves pharaohs. Even in decline, the new kingdom cast a cultural afterglow. The Book of the Dead reached its canonical form. Tutankhamun's treasures, rediscovered in 1922, reignited global fascination. And the stone colossi and hypostyle columns remained so imposing that Greek tourists in the first millennium BCE believed giants must have raised them. From Sneferu's patient experiments to Ramesses II's colossal propaganda, Egypt's builders fused theology, engineering, and statecraft across 15 centuries, turning the Nile Valley into a living monument that still shapes our image of antiquity. Chinese chronicles locate the first hereditary throne, the Xia dynasty, on the Yellow River, centuries before any independent record. Later, Zhou-era texts name Yu the Great as flood tamer and founder, list 16 successors, and condemn the last Xia king as a tyrant toppled by the Shang. Archaeology offers tantalizing but inconclusive support. Urban layers at Erlitou in Henan, circa 19th century to 15th century BCE, display palatial timber halls on rammed earth terraces, bronze foundries, and turquoise-inlaid jades that fit the dates and scale of a proto-state. Some Chinese researchers equate Erlitou with Xia, arguing that a dynasty would hardly leave inscriptions while writing was still gestating. Many Western scholars reply that palaces do not prove a dynasty named Xia, and remind that the earliest Chinese script, late Shang oracle bone writing, never mentions pre-Shang rulers. What all agree on is that by 1700 BCE, the North China Plain hosted a stratified bronze culture organized around lineage rule, irrigated millet fields, and riverine trade. The stage was set for the first fully documented monarchy. Around 1600 BCE, a coalition of warlords under King Tang defeated the last Xia ruler and established a new capital at Zhengzhou, later shifting northeast to Yin, modern Anyang. Here, between roughly 1250 and 1046 BCE, every strand of High Bronze Age civilization coalesced. Thousands of shoulder blades and tortoise plastrons, cracked by heat and inscribed with terse queries, preserve the Shang court's daily agenda. Kings asked whether ancestors approved a hunt, whether a childbirth would be safe, or on which day to attack the enemies named Qiang or Gui. The crack pattern served as a verdict. A scribe then incised the question. Result: and sometimes fulfillment. These oracle bones reveal a syllabic script of some 1,000 characters, direct ancestor of modern Chinese, and fix a royal genealogy matching later records, ending with Di Xin, the last Shang king. Shang bronzes are monumental, square ding cauldrons, owl-shaped Zun vessels, and battle axes with ferocious totem masks. Piece mold casting allowed relief decoration impossible by lost wax, and some vessels exceed 800 kilograms. Such metallurgy demanded enormous fuel, or transport from far mines, and labor mobilization, all under royal control. In tombs, complete bronze sets mirror the banquet service used in life, signaling status even in death. Divination demanded recompense. Oracle texts routinely specify sacrifice 10 captives, 3 dogs, or 100 bovines. Excavation of royal tombs confirms scale. Pits at Anyang hold rows of beheaded prisoners and horse-drawn chariots. The richly furnished tomb of General Queen Fu Hao contained 16 sacrificed attendants and war gear, underscoring that elite women could command armies and rights alike. Shang kings led seasonal campaigns, capturing prisoners for tribute and sacrifice. Chariot teams, recently imported steppe technology, served as mobile command platforms. Bronze-tipped halberds and composite bows armed infantry. Fortified towns connected by earthen roads formed a radiating network from the capital. By the mid-11th century BCE, vassal power blocks in the west rallied behind the Zhou clan. According to tradition, the last Shang king burned his treasures and leapt into the flames after defeat at Muye, circa 1046 BCE. Archaeology records a destruction layer at Anyang matching the date, yet Shang influence endured. Zhou rulers adopted bronze ritual forms and even maintained rites for Shang ancestors, a concession to the prestige of the fallen house. Indo-European nobles seized Hattusa in central Anatolia around 1650 BCE and forged the old Hittite kingdom. After a century-long eclipse, King Suppiluliuma I, circa 1350 BCE, created a great power, rivaling Egypt and Assyria. Hittite cuneiform archives, 30,000 tablets, record everything from treaty oaths sworn before the storm god Tahut to the instructions for chariot officers that standardized a 3-man heavy chariot crew. At Kadesh, 1274 BCE, Hittite chariots crashed into Ramesses II's divisions, leading to the first surviving peace treaty, inscribed in both Akkadian and Egyptian hieroglyphs. Yet Hattusa's grain ledgers also speak of famine. Letters plead for Egyptian shipments. Around 1190 BCE, Tusa was burned. Its population vanished, likely a victim of drought, internal revolt, and sea people's pressure. Neo-Hittite city-states lingered in Syria, but the empire was gone. On Crete, prosperous maritime polities built labyrinthine palaces at Knossos, Phaistos, and Zakros, circa 2000 to 1450 BCE. Central courts, magazines packed with olive oil jars, and frescoes of dolphin schools and bull leapers reveal a society geared to redistribution and ritual spectacle. Linear A tablets catalogue commodities but remain undeciphered. Absence of war iconography and city walls once led scholars to call Minoans peaceful, though weapon hordes suggest otherwise. The Thera volcanic eruption, 1628 BCE, devastated fleets and farms. A century later, Mycenaean Greeks overran Crete, repurposing Knossos and writing an early Greek script, Linear B Minoan artistic themes. The double axe, the snake goddess, meandering marine motifs, diffused throughout the Aegean, even as the civilization's autonomy expired. On the Greek mainland, citadel states such as Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns, circa 1600 to 1050 BCE, erected cyclopean walls and buried rulers with gold masks and boar-tusk helmets. Linear B tablets show palatial bureaucrats distributing bronze and chariot fittings, while Hittite letters name a Western Ahiyawa power meddling in Anatolia likely Mycenaean. Around 1200 BCE, destruction horizons sweep the Aegean. Palaces burn, scribal offices cease, and populations shrink by up to 75%. Drought clustering, earthquake storms, inland rebellions, and migrating sea peoples all find traction in the evidence. Within a generation, literacy vanished. Greece entered a centuries-long dark age remembered later only in epic as the age of heroic kings. While Hittite and Aegean states warred, Amorite-ruled Babylon reached its apex under Hammurabi r. 1792 to 1750 BCE. He unified central and southern Mesopotamia, renovated canals, and issued a diorite stele of 282 laws, the Code of Hammurabi. Far from simple lex talionis, the code graded penalties by social class, awilu, mushkenu, wardu, and protected widows, debtors, and orphans. Among its provisions, builders whose houses collapsed were liable with their own lives. Physicians were paid 10 shekels for healing a noble, but risked hand severance for fatal errors. After Hammurabi, Babylonian power waned, but the idea of the king as guarantor of justice persisted, influencing Hittite edicts, Israelite covenant law, and later Persian imperial decrees. From Anyang's bone cracks to Knossos' frescoed courts, from Hattusa's chariot schools to Babylon's carved laws, Bronze Age societies formed a tight but fragile mosaic of trade and tribute. Between 1200 and 1050 BCE, droughts, migration, and internal revolt shattered multiple nodes of that network. In the vacuum, iron-working frontier peoples and new ideological orders, the Joe, the Israelites, the Aramaeans, would inherit a world both enriched and cauterized by the Bronze Age's spectacular rise and precipitous collapse. Ashur began as a modest river shrine, whose rulers enriched themselves by caravan trade. Their merchants hauled tin and fine wool from the Tigris heartland to Anatolian market towns, exchanging them for silver that flowed straight into palace treasuries. Silver bought soldiers, and soldiers bought grain lands. By the 14th century BCE, the kings of Ashur had fortified posts along the Habur River and imposed taxes on every ferry and fodder field in reach. Those Middle Assyrian kings already managed war as an annual obligation. Clay tablets list levies down to the last slingstone and jar of beer, and a stern law code grades penalties by rank. Whipping for a farmer who dodges the call-up, impalement for a governor who withholds troops. Armorers near Ashur experimented with blister steel edges while most neighbors still cast bronze. A new creed emerged from these foundries. The god Ashur demanded expansion. Holding ground was spiritual failure. The doctrine would drive Assyria for the next 500 years. Ashurnasirpal II shifted the capital to Kalhu and rebuilt the army from the ground up. Wooden shields gave way to laminated iron. Archers drilled to fire in waves behind towers of rawhide and wicker. Sappers learned to tunnel under walls, while wheeled battering rams pounded above. Conquest became ritual theatre. After each victory, the kings sacrificed captives, flayed rebel leaders, and mounted their skins on city gates, a warning carved in screams as well as stone. His successors refined conquest into policy. Shalmaneser III tracked rival coalitions in the Levant, listing their exact chariot counts on victory stelae. Tiglath-Pileser III seized the throne, broke large provinces into small rotated governors yearly, and replaced seasonal levies with a full-time corps of spearmen and lancers. Conquered peoples, Arabs, Israelites, Aramaeans, were deported by the tens of thousands and resettled as farmers or craftsmen deep inside the empire. Grain from these transplants filled state granaries, their labor dug canals and raised new fortresses. Sargon II built a model capital, Dur-Sharrukin, with straight avenues and regimented barracks, then died in battle far from its gates. His son Sennacherib moved the court to Nineveh, encircled it with 18 kilometers of wall, and diverted a distant river over stone aqueducts to water royal gardens. Palace reliefs show the siege of Lachish in Judah, assault ramps crawling with infantry, defenders skewered on iron-head lances, and prisoners marched past piles of severed heads. Esarhaddon carried the war to Egypt, capturing Memphis and installing vassal princes. Ashurbanipal, last of the great warrior scholars, sacked Thebes, crushed a Babylonian uprising, and still found time to stock the royal library with flood myths and medical treatises. Yet the engine was running on fumes. Field reports from the final decades complain of arrears in soldiers' wages and villages emptied by overwork. In 612 BCE, a coalition of Medes and Babylonians breached Nineveh's walls. 3 years later, the last Assyrian army collapsed on the banks of the Euphrates. Assyria's empire vanished, but its blueprint endured. Provincial governors, military highways, mass deportations, and iron-armed infantry became standard gear for every state that followed, from Babylon to Persia. While Assyrian armies marched inland, a string of independent ports, Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, mastered the sea. Their shipwrights lengthened keels, added double steering oars, and stitched hull planks with linen soaked in resin. Cargo space itself became currency. Contracts at Tyre record mortgages calculated in hull length and deck width. From coastal Lebanon, purple dye, cedar beams, and glass beads sailed to Egypt and Spain, and payment returned in copper, tin, and silver. To label amphorae and warehouse ledgers quickly, Phoenician scribes paired earlier Semitic symbols down to 22 consonants. The result was an alphabet anyone could learn in a few weeks. Sailors carried the letters wherever they berthed. Greeks borrowed the signs and added vowels. Etruscans and Romans followed. And every modern Western script ultimately descends from those Phoenician strokes painted on humble jars of wine and oil. Highland villages in Canaan coalesced into petty kingdoms by the 9th century BCE. In the north, the Omride dynasty raised a palace at Samaria, sturdy enough to impress Assyrian scribes, who dubbed the realm House of Omri. When Shalmaneser V besieged Samaria, his successor Sargon announced the deportation of 27,000 Israelites and resettled foreigners in their stead, fracturing the kingdom beyond repair. Judah, smaller and poorer, survived by paying tribute, grain, gold, and linen, until King Hezekiah gambled on revolt. Sennacherib's armies razed 46 Judean towns and penned Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. The city bought mercy with temple silver, but Assyrian dominance was clear. Prosperity on the southern Levantine frontier belonged to those who mastered the rhythm of imperial favor. When Babylon supplanted Assyria, Judah misread the new balance. Nebuchadnezzar II captured Jerusalem, burned the temple, and marched its elite east to the canals of Mesopotamia. In exile, scribes wove royal archives and tribal lore into a written covenant that would outlive every empire that had humbled them. Proof that words can endure when walls fall. Assyrian iron and Phoenician letters traveled different roads, but together they reshaped the Near East. One gave states a model for rule by force and paperwork. The other gave merchants, prophets, and poets the simplest writing kit the world had yet seen. Out of armies and alphabets grew the next age of empires and scriptures, legacies still visible wherever modern alphabets record the ambitions of modern plain of Mui, as bronze spearheads gleamed against torchlight. In 1046, BCE King Wu of Zhou broke the Shang line, and with that victory, his house claimed a new doctrine: heaven grants rule only to the righteous. The mandate of heaven did more than excuse Zhou conquest. It established a political barometer. Thunder, drought, or rebellion could signal that a king's virtue had failed, and heaven's favor had shifted. Western Zhou rulers governed from Fenghao on the Wei River, rewarding relatives and allies with fiefs. Each vassal built an ancestral temple, cast ritual bronzes, and pledged seasonal tribute. The system worked while Zhou kings held military supremacy, but grain yields and local militias belonged to the lords, and over generations that autonomy hardened into independence. By 771 BCE, a coalition of disgruntled nobles and steppe invaders sacked the western capital, forcing the Zhou court east to Luoyang. The eastern Zhou kings still offered blessings in ancestral rites, yet their authority had shrunk to the ceremonial. Around 200 regional states now answered only to their own ambitions. During the spring and autumn era, the struggle for primacy coexisted with an unprecedented hunger for ideas. Confucius walked from court to court, urging rulers to govern through moral example, asserting that harmony grew when fathers acted with kindness, sons with respect, ministers with loyalty. Mozi denounced this hierarchy as partial and preached impartial care, while early Taoists advised rulers to do less, letting natural order prevail. Iron tools spread through river valleys, boosting harvests and multiplying mouths to feed. To finance armies, states minted spade-shaped coins and opened civil posts to commoners who could read bamboo slips. Competition bred patronage. Dukes kept scholars on stipends, hoping to purchase strategies along with eloquence. The 100 schools of thought thus flowered in the shadow of incessant skirmish. From 475 BCE, China entered the Warring States period, a generation-long arms race that forged the science of strategy. 7 dominant realms, Qin, Chu, Qi, Yan, Han, Zhao, Wei, fielded armies in the hundreds of thousands. Infantry armed with iron swords and mass-produced crossbows replaced aristocratic charioteers. Engineers built countermine galleries and articulated siege towers. Defenders stacked earthen ramparts 10 meters thick. On bamboo strips, generals studied Sun Tzu, whose art of war distilled campaigns into principles of deception, mobility, and psychological shock. The true revolution unfolded behind the lines. States abolished hereditary ranks, registering every household, taxing harvests directly, and promoting officers by battlefield merit. Xiangyang's reforms in Qin went furthest, rewarding farmers who exceeded quotas, punishing officials whose districts fell short, and dividing families into mutual responsibility groups that policed one another night and day. By the late 3rd century BCE, Qin commanders could mobilize and provision 500,000 soldiers through a lattice of roads converging on the Wei Valley, crushing Zhao's elite cavalry at Chengping in 260 BCE, then breaching Chu's river defenses. Qin King Zheng eliminated the last rival in 221 BCE. He assumed the title First Emperor, erasing the feudal order that the Zhou had once set in motion. Far to the west, on the Iranian plateau, another reformer reshaped belief itself. Zoroaster, an itinerant priest perhaps of the mid-1st millennium BCE, preached that all creation stands between 2 moral poles: Ahura Mazda, Lord of Truth, and Angra Mainyu, Spirit of Destruction. Humans possess the freedom and duty to choose truth through good thoughts, words, and deeds. Fire, symbol of Asha, burned in open altars. After death, each soul would cross the Chanvat Bridge and face judgment. Zoroaster's teaching rejected random fate in favor of ethical responsibility, a message that resonated among Eastern Iranian clans. By the 6th century BCE, its vocabulary of truth and lie informed the courts of rising Persian kings who invoked Ahura Mazda in inscriptions, swore oaths to uphold order, and condemned rebellion as drudge, falsehood. Cyrus II of Persia turned that ethical monarchy into an engine of conquest. In 550 BCE, he rebelled against his Median overlord, captured Ecbatana, and absorbed Median levies into a reorganized army of Persians, Medes, and allied cavalry. Crossing Anatolia, he defeated the Lydian king Croesus at Sardis in 546 BCE, then struck east, securing Bactria and the Oxus valleys. When Babylon surrendered in 539 BCE, Cyrus entered as liberator, promising in a royal proclamation to respect local gods and to repatriate exiles. Instead of deporting populations, he installed Persian satraps who retained existing temple economies, collected fixed tribute in silver, and answered to a corps of royal inspectors, the eyes and ears of the king. A new highway from Susa to Sardis enabled mounted couriers to traverse 2,500 kilometers in barely a week. Where Assyrian rule had relied on terror, Persian administration emphasized predictability. Subjects could keep their language, law, and worship so long as taxes arrived and order held. Upon Cyrus's death, campaigning against steppe nomads in 530 BCE, his successors expanded the template. Cambyses annexed Egypt. Darius standardized weights, struck gold Daric coins, and began carving his biography on the Behistun cliffs in 3 languages, proclaiming that Ahura Mazda had granted him the kingdom to punish the lie. Persian tolerance had limits. Xerxes later razed some shrines he judged impious. But the empire's breadth depended less on forced homogeneity than on a shared road system, common coinage, and the king's pledge to guard justice across 4 quarters of the world. Across 2 continents, Zhou ministers, Persian satraps, legalist reformers, and Zoroastrian priests pursued different answers to the same axial age question. How should power be justified and managed in societies now far too large for personal loyalties alone? In China, the answer lay first in heaven's conditional favor, and finally in uniform law wielded by a central monarch. In Iran, it lay in the cosmic struggle for truth made manifest by a king who ruled through fairness and respect for diversity. Both experiments forged durable political myths, and both produced structures that outlived their founders, shaping Asian governance for millennia to come. In 499 BCE, the Ionian cities of Asia Minor rose against their Persian satrap, and Athens sent a token force to help torch Sardis. King Darius I treated the raid as a challenge to imperial dignity. His first punitive expedition marched along the Aegean coast and fell at Marathon in 490 BCE when 10,000 Athenian hoplites sprinted across open ground, locked shields, and forced a larger Persian host back to their ships. A decade later, Darius's son Xerxes returned with a multi-ethnic army that bridged the Hellespont on pontoon floats and advanced by 2 parallel routes. Spartan king Leonidas and a small blocking force delayed the Persians for 2 days at the narrow pass of Thermopylae. When local scouts revealed a flanking trail, the Spartans held the rear guard and were cut down. Xerxes entered and evacuated Athens and burned temples on the Acropolis, yet naval control still mattered. In the Strait of Salamis, Themistocles lured the Persian fleet into cramped water, where Greek triremes, shorter and more agile, oared forward in successive rams. Persian losses convinced Xerxes to withdraw the bulk of his troops. The following year, a coalition of Greek city-states defeated the remaining Persian land force at Plataea and destroyed its reserve fleet at Mycale. Persia kept its empire, but the narrative reversed. Small citizen communities had turned the world's largest monarchy at bay, a moral victory that Greeks celebrated for generations. Athenian prestige after the wars turned the Delian League, originally a voluntary alliance, into a naval empire financed by tribute. At home, reforms had already replaced clan politics with institutions that gave every adult male citizen a vote in the assembly, seats by lot on juries, and the power to exile potential tyrants by ostracism. Under statesman Pericles, public pay let poorer citizens serve on council and row the fleet. Silver from the Laurian mines and league payments funded civic building. The Parthenon in marble, new long walls linking Athens to its port, and spacious stoas around the Agora. intellectual life thrived in the same open spaces. Playwrights competed with tragedies exploring hubris and divine justice. Comedies mocked policy and philosophers alike. Herodotus collected oral testimony on distant peoples, while the younger Thucydides crafted a forensic style of history based on eyewitness review. Sculptors refined natural stance and anatomical detail. Mathematicians formalized geometry, and sophists taught rhetoric to anyone able to pay. Criticized by Socrates, who questioned motives and methods in the marketplace. Democracy was not universal. Women, slaves, and resident foreigners remained excluded. Yet the system's reliance on debate and majority rule left an archival record of decrees, inscriptions, and speeches that shows government as a conscious civic project rather than inherited privilege. Athenian dominance alarmed Sparta, whose power rested on disciplined hoplites and a helot labor force. When Corinth and other allies pressed for action, Sparta declared war in 431 BCE. Athens relied on walls and fleet, importing grain while raiding the Peloponnese. A plague inside the crowded city killed Pericles and a quarter of the population. Still, the war dragged through shifting alliances and ideological propaganda. In 415 BCE, Athens launched a grand expedition to Sicily seeking new revenue. The force was destroyed at Syracuse, and Persian subsidies soon paid for a Spartan navy. Lysander's blockade of the Hellespont cut Athenian grain lifelines, and in 404 BCE, Athens capitulated. The conflict left all major polis exhausted, their treasuries empty and fields fallow, clearing a path for a peripheral kingdom to set new terms. When Philip II assumed Macedonia's throne in 359 BCE, his realm was a buffer between Greek cities to the south and Thracian tribes to the north. Philip reorganized society around a standing army financed by royal control of timber and silver. Infantry drilled in a dense phalanx wielding the sarissa pike twice the length of a hoplite spear. Combined with companion cavalry wedges, the formation could hold and pierce in coordinated strikes. Engineers developed torsion catapults and mobile siege towers able to breach stone walls previously thought impregnable. Diplomatically, Philip married into neighboring houses, bribed rivals, and positioned himself as leader of a pan-Hellenic crusade against Persia. At Cheronea in 338 BCE, his forces routed an allied army of Athens and Thebes, ending independent city-state warfare. From the League of Corinth, he commanded a unified Greek front, but an assassin's knife cut short his planned invasion. Alexander III, 20 years old, moved fast. In 334 BCE, he crossed the Hellespont with roughly 45,000 troops, visited the legendary site of Troy, and beat Persian satraps at the Granicus River. He then swept south along the coast to deny Persia naval bases. Siege of the island city Tyre required building a kilometre-long causeway. After 7 months the walls fell, and the Mediterranean gateway belonged to Macedonia. Crowned pharaoh in Egypt, Alexander founded Alexandria at the Nile's mouth, selecting its grid and harbour. Turning east, he met King Darius III at Issus in 333 BCE, and again at Gaugamela in 331 BCE. Both times the Persian monarch fled, and the empire's command structure collapsed. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis opened their treasuries. Persia's road network and satrap administration transferred almost intact to Macedonian oversight. Instead of stopping, Alexander pursued consolidation by fusion. He recruited Iranian cavalry, adopted certain court rituals, and married Roxana of Bactria, later staging mass weddings between Macedonian officers and Persian nobles at Susa. Campaigns pushed through the Hindu Kush into the Punjab. At the Hydaspes River, he defeated King Porus, then reluctantly turned back when officers refused to march beyond the Beas. The march home through the Gedrosian desert cost more lives than any battle. In Babylon, Alexander organized plans for Arabian exploration and integrated military colonies, but fever took him in 323 BCE before implementation. He left no adult heir, only a half-brother and an unborn son, and his commanders seized what they could. 40 years of rivalry among the Diadochi resolved into 3 durable monarchies. Ptolemies ruled Egypt from Alexandria, blending Greek administration with pharaonic imagery and exporting grain across the Mediterranean. Seleucids inherited the bulk of Asian territories, founding new polis from Antioch to Ai-Khanoum and issuing royal decrees in both Greek and Aramaic. Antigonids held Macedonia and influence over mainland Greece through military garrisons. Smaller realms, Pergamon in Asia Minor, Bactria beyond the Oxus, joined the mosaic. Despite near-constant war, the Hellenistic world shared a coined Greek language that facilitated trade from the Adriatic to the Indus. Philosophers developed Stoicism and Epicureanism to guide individuals in multinational societies. Mathematicians at Alexandria measured Earth's circumference and compiled geometry. Sculptors produced dynamic forms like the Winged Victory and Laocoon group. Royal sponsorship of libraries, lighthouses and observatories turned cities into laboratories of science and art. Politically fragmented yet culturally integrated, the Hellenistic oikoumene became the conduit through which Greek ideas, Persian governance, Egyptian astronomy and Mesopotamian mathematics mingled, and through which Rome first encountered a broader Eastern world. The Hellenic wave thus advanced in phases: citizen militias halting an empire, a democracy reaching its creative zenith, internecine war weakening the mainland, a Macedonian army redefining tactics, and a single commander carrying Greek language across 3 continents. In the states that followed, fusion rather than conquest proved the lasting legacy, laying intellectual and economic foundations that the next Mediterranean superpower would inherit and adapt. "200 years after Alexander's veterans quit the Indus Valley, a new Indian dynasty forged its own continental order. Chandragupta Maurya, who began as a minor adventurer in Magadha, dethroned the Nanda king around 322 BCE. Guided by his strategist Chanakya, he built a court at Pataliputra, whose wooden palisades stretched farther than any polis wall in the Greek world. Revenue flowed from a land tax assessed by royal surveyors, from crown monopolies on iron, salt, and war elephants, and from toll gates on the trunk roads that fanned across the Ganges plain. When Seleucus IV marched east to reclaim Alexander's conquests in 305 BCE, Chandragupta met him with an army so large that the Macedonian exchanged territory for peace, cemented by a marriage alliance, and the gift of 500 armoured elephants. Chandragupta's grandson, Ashoka, inherited this machinery in 268 BCE and used it to conquer Kalinga, a coastal realm famed for hardwood and sailors. The campaign succeeded, but left the battlefield littered with corpses and captives. Ashoka, by his own inscription, looked upon the carnage and felt remorse. He adopted the Dhamma, an ethical program drawn from Buddhism yet aimed at all creeds, and publicized it on pillars and rock faces from Afghanistan to southern India. Written in vernacular Prakrits, these edicts order officials to protect wildlife, dig wells for travelers, and judge lawsuits without haste or cruelty. They also proclaim religious tolerance. All sects desire self-control, therefore one should honor other sects. Ashoka continued to collect taxes and garrison frontiers, but his post-Kalinga policy shifted from expansion to moral suasion. He sent emissaries to Sri Lanka and Alexandria, convened councils of monks, and built rest houses beside caravan routes. The Mauryan chassis of spies, land registers, and standing infantry remained intact, yet its driver now declared conquest by righteousness superior to conquest by the sword. After Ashoka's death in 232 BCE, court factions and provincial governors peeled away, and by 185 BCE, the Maurya realm had fractured. Still, the twin legacies of empire and ethical kingship haunted Indian political thought long after the pillars had fallen. On the opposite end of Asia, a state once dismissed by Eastern neighbors as semi-barbarous perfected the science of war honed during the Warring States era. Qin, lying against the northern steppe, had already adopted Xiangyang's reforms: equal field agriculture, collective liability among peasant households, rewards for soldiers who took enemy heads, and cadastral surveys that delivered grain straight to the arsenal. Between 230 and 221 BCE, King Zheng annihilated 6 rival kingdoms through sequential campaigns, then declared himself Shi Huangdi, the first emperor. Having ended feudal partitions, he divided the realm into commanderies run by salaried magistrates, each audited by roving inspectors. To erase regional differences, he standardized bronze coinage, axle widths, weights, measures, and even the script itself, issuing new character forms that every clerk could read. Miles of tamped earth highways converged on the capital Xianyang, while forced labor gangs linked earlier border ramparts into the first long wall across the northern frontier. A parallel cultural policy aimed at dissent. Private copies of chronicles that praised former dynasties were ordered confiscated. Some scholars who defied the edict were executed, a warning that the age of competing philosophies had ended in legalist discipline. The emperor's appetite for permanence expressed itself in his tomb. Outside modern Xi'an lies a buried city guarded by thousands of life-size terracotta soldiers, each face modeled as distinct as a living recruit's. Such extravagance required harvest quotas and corvée drafts that strained commoners. On a tour of the eastern provinces in 210 BCE, Shi Huangdi died. Within 4 years, mutinies toppled the dynasty. Yet its skeletal framework, commandery rule, unified writing, arterial roads, survived every later Chinese kingdom, proof that institution could outlive the ideology that forged it. Rebel leader Liu Bang seized the capital in 206 BCE and, as Emperor Gaozu, moderated Qin's severity while preserving its bureaucracy. Over the next 4 centuries, interrupted only briefly by the usurper Wang Mang, the Han dynasty presided over a population that approached 60 million and a territory stretching from Korea to the jungles of northern Vietnam and the dunes of the Tarim Basin. Emperor Wu, reigning from 141 to 87 BCE, turned defense into outward projection. He financed cavalry expeditions that shattered the Xiongnu nomads, planted military colonies in Gansu, and opened garrisons along the Hexi corridor. In 138 BCE, he dispatched envoy Zhang Qian to seek allies beyond the Pamirs. Zhang returned a decade later with news of Dayuan's tall horses and Bactrian markets for silk. Caravans soon threaded oases where Han officials stamped customs tablets in wooden tallies. The same route carried glass, incense, and eventually Buddhist monks. Chang'an, capital of Western Han, became the eastern terminus of this Silk Road. Its markets stocked with Central Asian grapes and Roman glassware, its archives swelling with tax registers written on newly invented paper. Domestically, the dynasty fused legalist administration with Confucian ethic. An imperial university founded in 124 BCE taught the 5 classics to thousands of students who then sat examinations for office. Bronze, salt and iron monopolies funded court rituals and frontier wars. Seismographs and water clocks monitored earth and sky. Lacquer coffins preserved the dead in aristocratic tombs while astronomical records tracked comets and sunspots for the living. By the 1st century CE, Chinese silk reached Syrian ports where Roman writers fretted over lost bullion. In return, Han annals recorded an embassy from Daxin that sailed up the Pearl River in 166 CE. The exchange was indirect yet real, binding 2 imperial worlds at Asia's waist. Long before the Han ventured west, horse archer confederations had learned how to tax settled neighbors by raid, treaty, or transit toll. The Xiongnu, under Modu Chanyu, forged the first such empire north of the Great Wall around 209 BCE, organizing clans into left and right wings and drilling them to feign retreat, encircle, then shower enemies with arrows. Early Han emperors, unable to match their mobility, sent princesses and annual gifts of silk and grain. Emperor Wu reversed the arrangement. A series of winter offensives drove the Xiongnu north, split the confederation, and enticed rival tribes to become Han allies. Some Xiongnu migrated west toward the Aral steppe, others settled as semi-vassals inside China proper. The pattern, war, alliance, resettlement, set the template for Sino-nomad relations for a millennium. Where Iranian plateau meets Mesopotamian plain, the Arsacid house of Parthia rose from mounted archers who had once served under Seleucid banners. By the late 2nd century BCE, they had seized Babylon, adopted the title King of Kings, and ruled a patchwork of Hellenized cities and Iranian clan estates. Parthian nobles rode at need, carrying composite bows and armored lances. At Carrhae in 53 BCE, their horse archers lured a larger Roman army onto open steppe, then destroyed it with the famed Parthian shot, feigned flight followed by arrows loosed over the shoulder. Yet their real power was geographic. They sat astride the east-west caravan road, taxing silk en route to the Mediterranean and bullion bound for Han outposts. Greek remained a language of urban lore. Zoroastrian fire shrines burned in upland sanctuaries, and Assassid kings minted coins that displayed Greek legends on one face, archer kings on the other. In this mesh of cultures, goods moved more reliably than armies, and merchants were the surest ambassadors between Rome and China. Across the heart of the Old World, three great bureaucratic empires, the Maurya, Chinhan and Parthian, each learned to weld diverse peoples under a single fiscal and legal canopy, while steppe confederacies challenged every agrarian frontier. From Ashoka's pillars to the Silk Road relays, from legalist statutes to Parthian caravan tolls, Asia perfected the art of governing at continental scale and the habit of exchanging ideas across deserts and mountains. What began as campaigns for dominion ended as networks of roads, scripts, and faiths that would outlast the throne. When a she-wolf's imagined cry still echoed in storyteller's verse, the real Rome was a cluster of huts on the Tiber's bend. By the late 6th century BCE, its kings had raised stone walls, drained the marshy forum, and traced a sacred boundary, the Pomerium, around a growing town. Yet the last monarch, Tarquin the Proud, ruled by fear and left a bitter taste. In 509 BCE, leading clans expelled him and declared no man would ever be king again. They replaced hereditary sovereignty with an annual duet of elected magistrates called consuls, each able to veto the other, both checked by a senate of elders and by popular assemblies that could pass laws and pronounce judgment. The Republic was born less as a democracy than as an oligarchy restrained by procedure, but its machinery proved astonishingly resilient. For 2 centuries, the new state fought successive wars that knit central Italy into a single system. First came battles with neighboring Latin towns, settled by treaties that extended partial citizenship and demanded soldiers in Rome's wars. 3 Samnite wars followed, brutal contests in the central Apennines that taught Roman commanders to build fortified roads and to field flexible manipular legions rather than the rigid hoplite formations of old. In 280 BCE, King Pyrrhus of Epirus crossed the Adriatic with war elephants to defend Greek colonies in the south. His victories cost so dearly that Pyrrhic forever after meant winning like losing. When he sailed home, Rome absorbed Magna Graecia and stood master of the peninsula from the Arno to the Strait of Messina. Control of Italy drew Rome into the wider Mediterranean, and there it met Carthage. The Punic city's warships policed trade lanes from Spain to Sicily. Its merchants trafficked in silver, grain, and purple dye, and its governing council hired mercenaries by the tens of thousands. In 264 BCE, a dispute over Messina triggered the First Punic War. Rome, a novice at sea, copied a captured Carthaginian quinquereme, mass-produced fleets, and turned naval battles into floating land engagements by installing boarding bridges called corvi. After 23 grinding years, Carthage ceded Sicily, Rome's first overseas province, and soon lost Sardinia and Corsica as the price of failure. The peace lasted scarcely a generation. In 218 BCE, Hannibal Barca marched an army from Spain across the Alps in snow and silence, emerging into Italy with war elephants and Iberian cavalry. At Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and finally Cannae, he annihilated Roman legions with enveloping tactics still studied in military academies. Panic shook the Republic, but its institutions held. The Senate refused negotiation, raised fresh armies, and adopted Fabius Maximus's strategy of delay: harass the Carthaginians, avoid pitched battle, starve them of allies. Meanwhile, Publius Cornelius Scipio, later surnamed Africanus, carried the war into Spain, then onto African soil. When Hannibal hurried home, Scipio defeated him at Zama in 202 BCE, stripping Carthage of its empire and fleet. The victory left Rome dominant, yet anxious. Provinces in Spain and Greece demanded governors. The treasury swelled with indemnities and Iberian silver. Veteran soldiers returned to find small farms swallowed by latifundia, worked by war captives. Social tension flared. In 133 BCE, tribune Tiberius Gracchus tried to redistribute public land. A senatorial mob clubbed him to death, inaugurating a century in which politics and violence merged. His brother Gaius met a similar fate. Gaius Marius, a populist general, opened the legions to the landless and rewarded them with plunder and plots of conquered land, forging personal loyalty between troops and commander rather than state. Civil clashes erupted between Marius and the patrician Sulla, who in 82 BCE marched on Rome, posted lists of enemies for execution, and reigned as dictator before retiring in uneasy triumph. Out of the turbulence rose ambitious patrons who cast themselves as saviors. Crassus crushed Spartacus's slave revolt, but died in Parthia. Pompey cleared pirates from the eastern Mediterranean and reorganized Asia Minor. Their uneasy alliance with a rising Julius Caesar, sealed in the first triumvirate, collapsed once Caesar's conquest of Gaul showered him with wealth and a fiercely devoted army. Ordered to disband his legions, he crossed the Rubicon in 49 BCE with the terse announcement, "The die is cast." Civil war ended at Pharsalus when Caesar routed Pompey, who fled to Egypt and was murdered on the shore. Caesar followed, dallied with Cleopatra, reformed the calendar, enlarged the Senate, and accepted the title Perpetual Dictator. Senators who feared monarchy answered with knives on the Ides of March, 44 BCE. They killed the man but not the crisis. Republic and empire now stood on either side of a razor. Caesar's heir, the youthful Gaius Octavius, soon Octavian, joined Marcus Antonius and Lepidus in a second triumvirate that legitimized vengeance. Proscriptions funded their armies. At Philippi they crushed Caesar's assassins. Lepidus slipped into irrelevance, leaving Antony to govern the east and Octavian the west. Antony's liaison with Cleopatra VII alarmed Roman opinion. Octavian seized the moral high ground, portrayed the pair as oriental despots, and won a climactic naval victory at Actium in 31 BCE. The following year, Antony and Cleopatra died in Alexandria, and Octavian returned to Rome, sole victor. Rather than claim kingship, he engineered consensus. In 27 BCE, the Senate bestowed on him the honorific Augustus, the revered one, and control of the empire's key provinces. A second settlement in 23 BCE granted tribunician power for life and command of the armies, without the inflammatory title of Rex. Augustus professionalized the legions with fixed terms and pensions funded by an inheritance tax, established the Praetorian Guard to protect the ruler and, in time, make and unmake emperors, and launched building programs that turned a city of brick in his boast into one of marble. Poets hailed a new golden age. Virgil traced Rome's destiny from Trojan Aeneas. Livy wrote a history that extolled civic virtue. Horace promised monuments more lasting than bronze. Yet Augustus also secured boundaries. Roman eagles advanced to the Danube, and later to the Elbe, while a client kingdom buffer zone shielded Syria from Parthian cavalry. His careful architecture of power endured, and for 2 centuries, the Mediterranean enjoyed what later historians called the Pax Romana. Roads arrowed from the Milvian Bridge to Scotland and the Nile cataracts, patrolled by mounted couriers who could carry a message 100 kilometers in a day. Aqueducts thrust across valleys to pour clean water into dense cities. Amphitheatres and baths standardized leisure from Lusitania to Cappadocia. Latin became the language of law and administration in the West, Greek the lingua franca of commerce and scholarship in the East. Provincial elites sent sons to study rhetoric in Rome, sat on local councils, and rose to senatorial rank, weaving empire and ambition together. Citizenship, once a jealously guarded birthright, extended first to Italian allies, then to legion veterans, and finally, under Caracalla in 212 CE, to almost every free inhabitant. A fiscal as well as ideological act that universalized Roman identity. Trade caravans carried pepper and silk to the markets of Ostia. Grain fleets crossed from Alexandria to feed 1 million mouths. Spanish olive oil and Gallic wine filled amphorae, stacked in warehouses along the Tiber. The imperial cult offered a civic liturgy, transcending ethnic gods. To sacrifice for the emperor's genius was to affirm place in a vast commonwealth. Legions held the line at the Rhine and the Euphrates, their camps seeding future European cities. Their veterans granted farmland that Latinized frontiers. Law codifiers distilled centuries of precedent into principles of contract, property, and personal status that would shape jurisprudence long after Rome's fall. Yet even in its noon, the empire carried seeds of dusk, costly frontier wars, succession crises, and rising provincial autonomy. Those belonged to later chapters. In the age from the expulsion of kings to the settled rule of Caesars, Rome experimented with every form of governance. Monarchy discarded, republic improvised, dictatorship stumbled, and principate perfected, while uniting the Mediterranean in a web of roads, laws, and stories still visible in the stones of its surviving bridges and in the rhythms of modern speech. During the first centuries of our era, great centers of power flourished far from Rome's marble forums or China's walled capitals. Realms that knit whole regions together, minted new styles of art, and moved ideas across mountains and seas. North of the Hindu Kush, the Kushan kingdom rose from the ashes of earlier nomad confederations. Its second ruler, Vima Kadphises, struck gold coins bearing both Greek letters and the image of Shiva, an emblem of how readily this empire blended cultures along the Silk routes. Under Kanishka, who reigned in the early 2nd century, caravan cities such as Taxila and Peshawar bustled with Iranian merchants, Roman glassware, and Chinese silks. Kanishka's court sponsored Buddhist monks in Sanskrit and Gandhari, dispatching missionaries who carried portable reliquaries as far as Central Asia. One of his stupas, the Kanishka Mahavihara at Peshawar, reputedly soared higher than any pagoda in China and became a beehive for pilgrims translating scripture into new tongues. By merging steppe cavalry, Iranian administration, and Indian religion, the Kushans turned the Upper Indus into a hinge between South and Central Asia. Across the Atlantic, in the high basin of central Mexico, Teotihuacan emerged around the 1st century CE as Mesoamerica's first true metropolis. Its main avenue, later called the Street of the Dead, stretched 2 kilometers, anchoring pyramids dedicated to the sun and the moon. Residents lived in apartment compounds, decorated with murals of feathered serpents and spider monkeys. Obsidian workshops supplied blades traded hundreds of kilometers away. No royal tomb identifies a single ruler, hinting that authority may have rested with corporate lineage councils rather than a king. Teotihuacan's armies nonetheless marched far. Painted war butterflies appear on stelae in the distant Maya city of Tikal. Testimony that Teotihuacan soldiers once toppled local dynasties and installed friendly heirs. When the great city's palaces burned in the 6th century, refugees dispersed its architectural styles. The talud tablero facade and the thin orange ceramics throughout the Mexican plateau, ensuring its cultural afterglow long outlasted its political life. In the tropical lowlands east of Teotihuacan, Maya lords carved dynastic boasts into limestone at sites such as El Mirador and Calakmul. By the 3rd century CE, scribes recording royal births and battles had refined a vigesimal calendar that meshed a 365-day solar cycle with a 260-day ritual count. Astronomer priests tracked Venus through morning and evening skies, timing wars to the planet's heliacal rise. Stone courts echoed with the thump of rubber balls in ritual games that dramatized cosmic renewal. City-states rarely unified for long. Instead, they forged shifting alliances sealed by royal marriages, each victory etched on stelae with exact long count dates that let modern epigraphers read their history day by day. Drought after 800 CE would stress these kingdoms. But during the early classic period, their temples of corbelled stone and their bark paper books stood as experiments in how complex a rainforest civilization could become. Far to the east, the kingdom of Aksum flourished on the rocky plateau of northern Ethiopia. Camel caravans loaded with ivory, frankincense, and glass beads descended its mountain passes to the Red Sea port of Adulis, where Greek-speaking merchants bargained for cargo bound to Roman Egypt and the Persian Gulf. Aksumite kings minted coins in gold and silver, first with pagan disc and crescent emblems, later with crosses after King Azana adopted Christianity in the 4th century. Stelae carved from single granite slabs marked royal tombs, some rising 30 meters before earthquake and time toppled them. With control of highland agriculture and coastal entrepôts alike, Aksum mediated trade between the Mediterranean world and the monsoon routes of India, proving that sub-Saharan Africa participated vigorously in the commerce and religions of late antiquity. While Aksum linked seas, the Gupta dynasty presided over a classical age on the Indian subcontinent. Around 320 CE, Chandragupta III married into the powerful Licchavi clan of the Ganges Plain and began styling himself Great King of Kings. He ruled from Pataliputra, where wooden palisades had once guarded Mauryan courts. Now brick ramparts defended gardens, monasteries, and a royal mint pouring out silver denarii, modelled on earlier Indo-Greek issues. His son Samudragupta, remembered in later inscription as a poet king, campaigned down the east coast, accepting tribute from forest chiefs and island monarchs alike. Instead of annexing every territory, he reinstalled local rulers as feudatories, weaving loyalty through ritual hierarchy rather than permanent garrisons. Cultural patronage reached new heights under Chandragupta II, whose reign opened the 4th century's final decades. Iron pillars wrought near Delhi resisted corrosion for centuries, an advertisement of metallurgical skill equal to any in the ancient world. Sanskrit literature flowered in court assemblies. The playwright Kalidasa composed dramas whose heroes wandered both Himalayan peaks and celestial realms, setting aesthetic standards for a millennium. Mathematicians in Ujjain treated 0 as a numeral, advanced algorithms for square roots, and calculated pi with a precision rivaling Hellenistic estimates. Astronomer Aryabhata proposed that Earth rotated on its axis and traced eclipses to the shadows of celestial bodies rather than to mythic dragons. Buddhist monasteries at Nalanda expanded into a residential university, attracting students from Sri Lanka, Java, and distant China. Yet the Guptas themselves leaned toward a revived Hindu synthesis. Stone temples evolved from wooden prototypes into shikaras, towering spires symbolizing sacred mountains, while sculptors carved sandstone panels of Krishna lifting Govardhan Hill or of Shiva dancing the cosmic cycle. Pilgrims walking the circumambulation path viewed stories in sequence, a visual scripture accessible to lay worshippers and scholars alike. Political stability allowed artisans to specialize: silk weavers in Bengal, skilled ivory carvers in Mathura, goldsmiths in Malwa. Guilds fixed wages, collected dues for communal shrines, and sometimes minted their own copper coins. Long-distance merchants moving through Gupta customs houses carried Sanskrit manuals on weights and arithmetic, spreading decimal notation across trading networks that stretched to Southeast Asia, where Gupta-influenced scripts appear on early Cambodian stele. Even this golden order faced strains. In the late 5th century, Huna raids pierced the northwest frontier, toppling provincial governors and draining the treasury. Local princes regained autonomy. Land grants to Brahmin temples eroded the tax base. Irrigation canals silted without central oversight. Yet the intellectual and artistic canons forged under the Guptas endured. Gupta-style sculptures travelled with monks to Java and with traders to Thailand. Sanskrit remained the language of science and diplomacy across South and Southeast Asia long after Gupta courts fell silent. Beyond the Mediterranean world, then, imperial mosaics took distinctive shapes. Kushan syncretism along the Silk Road, Mesoamerican city planning in Teotihuacan, Maya chronicles of kings and constellations, Aksumite coinage ringing across 2 seas, and Gupta polities where poetry and algebra shared the same royal seal. Each wove regional threads into the broader fabric of antiquity, proving that advanced urban life, long-distance exchange, and bursts of scientific insight were global phenomena, not the province of any single sea. Persia emerged in 224 CE, when Ardashir, a provincial magnate from Persis, defeated the last Arsacid king and revived memories of Achaemenid grandeur. His son Shapur-Finir pushed westward in lightning raids, overrunning Roman fortresses on the Euphrates, capturing Antioch, and in 260 taking Emperor Valerian alive, the first and only time a Roman ruler marched into Persian custody. Carved reliefs at Nakshi Rustam still show the captive kneeling while Persian nobles watch in grave silence. The ransomless triumph announced that power in the Middle East had shifted. Subsequent shahs invested in walled frontier towns called Sasan, canals on the Tigris, and a bureaucracy that recorded land grants on leather scrolls sealed by silver bullae. Under Kavad Twine and his formidable son Khusraudak, the empire reached a bureaucratic zenith. Tax surveyors assessed each parcel. Cavalrymen drew state rations, and academy physicians in Jundishapur translated Greek medical texts into Middle Persian. For 4 centuries, the Roman-Persian frontier fell quiet only in brief truces. The Anastasian War opened in 502, the Iberian War in 526. The so-called Long War escalated in 572, and bled both empires for 6 decades. When Khusrau II occupied Egypt and camped within sight of Constantinople's walls in 626, the dream of a restored Achaemenid realm seemed plausible. Yet the Shah's levies were overstretched and his court faction-ridden. Emperor Heraclius counter-invaded through Armenia, looted Ctesiphon's suburbs, and in 628 forced Persia to disgorge its gains. Neither victor could celebrate. Persia's treasury was empty, its provinces smouldering. Rome's levies were exhausted, its grain ships lost. Two superpowers had ground each other into ruin on the eve of a new Arabian faith that neither yet perceived. While Persia and Rome exchanged sieges, China fractured into three rival states. The last Han sovereign abdicated in 220 CE, leaving generals to crown themselves. Cao Wei ruled the north from Luoyang. Shu Han held the Sichuan Basin, and Eastern Wu commanded the lower Yangtze. Battles at Red Cliffs and Yiling settled little. Marshaled armies relied on repeating crossbows and mass-produced iron swords, but geography and river barriers prolonged stalemate. In civilian life, invention quickened. Engineers regulated floodgates on the Yellow River. Mechanics improved piston bellows for blast furnaces, and scholars compiled medical formulas in the canon of the pulse. Paper, once a court luxury, spread to local administration, replacing heavy bamboo slips and accelerating record-keeping. After half a century of maneuver, the Northern Kingdom absorbed its rivals and founded the short-lived Jin. But the memory of tripartite contention, immortalized in the epic romance of the Three Kingdoms, outlived every dynasty. On the western Mediterranean shore, another transformation was gathering. Constantine, son of a Balkan officer in the Tetrarchy, marched from York across Gaul and Italy in 312 CE. At the Milvian Bridge, he fought under a symbol he interpreted as Christ's monogram and won control of the Western Empire. By 324, he ruled alone. The Edict of Milan legalized Christianity, and imperial subsidies raised basilicas beside defeated pagan temples. Bishops met at Nicaea in 325 to settle doctrine under the emperor's patronage, forging a precedent in which theological unity buttressed state cohesion. Constantine founded a new capital on the Bosporus, Constantinople, ringed it with Theodosian walls, and staffed its senate with eastern landowners, signaling that imperial focus had shifted from the old Forum of Rome to a defensible mercantile crossroads between Europe and Asia. Across the steppes north of the Black Sea, mounted archers later called Huns spilled westward after 370 CE, crossing the frozen Volga and scattering Alans and Goths before them. Refugees pressed against the Danube limes, begging Roman entry. When officials mishandled their resettlement, the newcomers revolted and in 378 annihilated Emperor Valens at Adrianople. The Huns themselves did not settle. They raided, taxed, moved on. Under Attila, they extracted gold from both Roman courts and rode as far as Orleans, where coalition forces checked them at the Catalonian plains in 451. Attila's death splintered their confederation, yet the damage was done. Frontier peoples armed themselves, imperial officers recruited barbarian warlords, and the old Rhine-Danube boundary became a mere line on parchment. The western half of Rome, already strained by tax shortfalls and palace coups, unraveled fast after these shocks. Germanic federates settled inside provincial borders as foederati, nominal allies, but autonomous in fact. In 406 Vandals and Alans crossed the frozen Rhine. By 429, the Vandals had sailed to North Africa, capturing Carthage and Rome's grain lifeline. The city of Rome endured its first sack in 8 centuries, when Visigoth King Alaric marched through the Salarian Gate in 410. Another followed in 455 under the Vandals. Imperial authority devolved into regional commands. In Gaul, the general Aetius balanced Visigoths against Franks. In Italy, the Magister Militum Reichsima made and unmade puppet emperors drawn from senatorial families. Fiscal records shrank to scraps, mints debased the silver siliqua. Frontier bishops evolved into civic patrons, dispensing charity where tax collectors no longer reached. In 476, the Germanic officer Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus, a teenage figurehead. and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. The act has long marked the fall of the Western Roman Empire, yet many Roman habits lingered. Courts still cited imperial law codes, villas still pressed olive oil in Campania, and the Eastern Emperor still conferred titles on Italian rulers. What vanished was the tax-fed professional army, the ability to repair aqueducts across provinces, and the conviction, shared since Augustus, that a single sovereign could guarantee Mediterranean order. From Persian palaces stripped by civil war, to Italian forums patrolled by Gothic guards, late antiquity closed amid storms that toppled thrones, yet transferred skills. Sassanid cavalry drill influenced Arab forces. Chinese paper would reach Samarkand and, in time, Baghdad. Roman roads guided Lombard migrations. The classical world did not end. It reorganized under new banners, each inheriting fragments of an older, wider realm. In the eastern half of the Mediterranean world, Constantinople stood behind its double Theodosian walls, a city of domes and colonnades that kept the idea of Rome alive long after legions vanished from Britain and Gaul. Greek now filled the streets more than Latin, yet imperial edicts still bore the solemn phrase Imperator Caesar. Justinian, who reigned from 527 to 565, dreamed of restoring the whole inheritance. His general Belisarius reconquered North Africa and Italy, while engineers raised the Hagia Sophia, its soaring vault lit by chains of oil lamps that shimmered on golden mosaics. Justinian's jurists gathered centuries of statute and precedent into the Corpus Juris Civilis, fixing Roman law for a future that would not be Roman. Eastward, beyond the Euphrates, Sassanid Persia cultivated the same ambition in mirror image. From their twin capitals of Ctesiphon and Seleucia, Shahs traced descent from Cyrus and Darius, upholding Zoroastrian fire temples and a court protocol stiff with silk and silver. Khusrau I reformed taxes, sponsored physicians at Jundishapur, and inspected frontier fortresses that watched the Syrian desert. Between the two empires lay a frontier of mud brick forts, caravan, toll gates, and buffer kingdoms that changed hands whenever truce expired. A final collision began in 602. When the Byzantine Emperor Maurice was murdered in a palace coup, Khusrau II, claiming to avenge his ally, sent armies that overran Syria, Egypt, and much of Anatolia. Persian standards flew within sight of Constantinople's land walls. The true cross was carried off from Jerusalem. Emperor Heraclius answered with a winter march through Armenia, striking deep behind Persian lines. In December 627, his columns met the Sassanid host near the ruins of ancient Nineveh and shattered it. Khusrau was deposed soon after. Exhausted diplomats restored the old borders, but neither realm recovered its strength. Fields lay untilled, treasuries were empty, and frontier garrisons were thin shadows of the armies that had once marched under Eagle and Lion. South of those scarred provinces on the Arabian Peninsula, a different ferment unfolded. In the trading city of Mecca, Muhammad ibn Abdallah began around 610 to recite verses he proclaimed revelations from the one God. His message challenged tribal idols and warned of a final judgment binding on all humanity. After years of opposition, the small community migrated north to Yathrib, soon Medina, in 622, marking the first year of the Islamic calendar. There Muhammad forged a polity that blended prophecy with governance. Arbitration of clan disputes, regulation of markets, and collective defense pledged under a single faith. Victories at Badr and the Trench confirmed for followers that God guided their cause. Alliances and conversions spread across Arabia until, in 630, Muhammad re-entered Mecca and cleansed the Kaaba of images. He died in 632, but the new community did not dissolve. Abu Bakr, elected as the first caliph, suppressed secession within Arabia. His successor Umar directed restless tribal energies outward. Horsemen who had once raided desert caravans now moved in disciplined columns toward the decaying frontier posts of the great empires. In 636, Byzantine field forces collapsed at the Yarmouk Gorge. In 637, the Sassanid line broke at Qadisiyah, and Ctesiphon fell within months. By 642, Egypt, the grain basket of the Mediterranean, accepted Muslim rule with little resistance from its weary garrisons. The caliphs levied a light head tax on non-Muslims, secured irrigation canals, and left local bureaucrats in place, ensuring that harvests flowed and cities prospered under new banners. Within a single generation, territories that Augustus and Khusrau had struggled to guard now acknowledged the authority of Medina and soon Damascus. Greek and Syriac scribes copied tax registers for Arab governors. Zoroastrian officials kept accounts in Middle Persian for new masters who at first still spoke Desert Arabic and penned treaties in the angular script of Mecca. Yet the change ran deeper than administrations. Pilgrims from the Nile Delta, the Caucasus, and the Indian Ocean converged yearly on Mecca, exchanging not only faith but techniques of irrigation, navigation, and mathematics. A common creed and a shared language began to weld three continents into a fresh sphere of exchange. In 651, the last Sassanid claimant fell in distant Khorasan, ending a dynasty that had contested Rome for 400 years. Byzantium survived behind its sea moat and chain-defended harbour, but its dominion was reduced to Anatolia and the Balkans. The ancient contest between eagle and lion, fought since the days of Trajan and Shapur, closed not with a decisive victory by either heir of antiquity, but with both superseded by a power that neither had foreseen. The age of classical empires passed into a world where the call to prayer echoed above former Roman forums and across once Persian canals, announcing a new order that would carry the intellectual legacies of Greece and Persia forward under the banner of Islam.